Right now, out on the dark, freezing waters of the world's oceans, there is a ghost armada silently moving millions of barrels of crude oil.
Yeah, it is a staggering thing to visualize. We are talking about roughly 1,300 aging, uninsured tankers.
Right, just roaming the seas, they are slipping through international choke points, carrying the financial lifeblood of a massive war effort.
And, well, some of them are literally rusting away, but most of them are operating completely outside of Western jurisdiction.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
And the most startling part, Western governments know all about them, but have found themselves legally and practically paralyzed to stop them.
Yeah, they're just stuck.
So welcome to Reformed Thinking. For this deep dive, our mission is to look at the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict through two distinct but overlapping lenses provided by the source material you shared with us.
Right, so first, we are going to look at the incredibly intricate mechanics of global energy markets, specifically the Western oil price caps that inadvertently birthed this ghost armada.
And second, which is equally as vital, we will examine the theological reality of human sin as explained by the Book of James and Reformed theology.
Just as a quick note at the top, though, for you listening, we are looking at this through the strict lenses of our source texts, so economic data and biblical theology.
Yeah, we take no sides regarding the political factions involved, whether left-wing or right-wing. We are just here to impartially report on the provided texts.
Right, texts which analyze the data without endorsing any earthly political kingdom. Our goal is to understand the mechanisms at play, both in the global markets and, well, in the human heart.
So to set the stage, let us establish the baseline. We are looking at the historical and geopolitical reality as of April 2026.
Meaning we are 4 years into this specific conflict.
Right. And the sources make it clear that modern warfare relies on massive, continuous revenue to sustain attrition.
It absolutely does.
So before we get into the heavy theology of James, let us talk about the money. When we see a conflict on the news, we usually see the kinetic side, right?
Yeah, the artillery, the troop movements, the drones.
But the sources argue that to really understand the battlefield, you have to look at the shipping lanes and the commodity prices first.
That is a great place to start, because the kinetic reality you see on the news is entirely downstream of the physical reality.
How so?
Well, to understand a war of attrition, you have to think of the military not just as an armed force, but as an incredibly expensive, fast-burning furnace.
A furnace that needs constant fuel.
Right. Armies require a staggering amount of funding for procurement, for logistics, and just for domestic macroeconomic stability.
You have to feed the soldiers, repair the damaged equipment, and manufacture new munitions at an industrial scale.
Exactly, and pay death benefits to families. But even beyond the direct military costs, there is the requirement of keeping the home front stable.
Because if a government is fighting a war and their domestic currency collapses or hyperinflation sets in, well, the civilian population cannot afford basic groceries.
Yeah, and when that happens, the political will to continue the war just evaporates. The war effort fails, even if the army is still technically standing in the field.
So the belligerent nation must maintain a river of cash.
Yes, and for a nation like Russia, that river of cash is primarily hydrocarbons, so oil and natural gas.
And in April 2026, 4 years into this conflict, the data shows us that the sheer financial burn rate is just astronomical.
Modern artillery shells, ballistic missiles, advanced drone technology, they cost millions of dollars daily.
Right. So when the Western coalition looked at this reality back in 2022, they realized a direct military confrontation was off the table due to the risk of nuclear escalation.
Therefore, the primary weapon they had left was economic statecraft. They needed to starve the furnace.
Cut off the revenue that was purchasing the munitions.
Yes, and that leads us to the specific mechanism of the G7 and European Union oil price cap instituted in December 2022.
The strategy was to use the global financial and maritime insurance infrastructure, which the West historically dominated, to pinch the revenue stream at the source.
But as the texts outline, designing an economic weapon against a massive energy exporter requires threading a very small needle.
I want to break down how that needle was threaded, actually. Yeah. Because the sources provide a fascinating look at the logic behind this specific policy.
It was not just a blunt instrument, that is for sure.
Right. So the G7 and the EU instituted this price cap in December 2022. The initial policy set a limit of $60 per barrel on seaborne crude.
They essentially told the market, you cannot buy Russian crude for more than this price.
Yeah. Later, in February 2023, they realized they needed to address refined products, so they added a two-tier structure.
They set a $100 limit for premium refined products, which includes things like diesel and kerosene.
And then they set a lower $45 limit for discount products, like fuel oil, which requires further processing.
The design is fascinating. They did not just issue a blanket embargo.
Right. They did not say nobody buys Russian oil, period.
Huh.
But why design the cap this way?
Well,
I mean, if the goal is to starve the furnace, why not just enforce a total global ban?
it is a fair question.
If you want to stop a nation from funding a war, a $60 cap seems like a half measure. Why let them make any money at all?
You are identifying the core tension of the entire policy. It feels counterintuitive to leave the spigot open when you want to stop the flow of funding.
Right. I know you as a listener might be wondering, why leave it open even a little bit?
The rationale behind that specific design reveals the incredible fragility of global interconnectedness. The Western coalition had a dual, almost contradictory goal.
Okay, what were the two goals?
On one hand, they needed to compress Russian state revenue to restrict the financial oxygen fueling the military campaign.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, Russia was producing roughly 8.6 million barrels of crude every single day.
That is a massive amount of oil.
Huge. If the West simply instituted a total embargo and magically pulled all those millions of barrels off the global market overnight, the resulting supply shock would have been catastrophic.
We are talking about a scenario where global crude prices could have skyrocketed to $150 or $200 a barrel.
Exactly. And in that scenario, lower-income nations would suffer immense economic damage, plunging millions into poverty.
Plus, the irony of a massive price spike is that Moscow might have ended up making more money by selling fewer barrels.
Right. If they sell half the volume but the price triples, their war chest actually grows.
So the cap was designed as a hybrid instrument.
It sought to keep Russian oil flowing to the market to stabilize global prices, while simultaneously separating the export volume from the export revenue.
And the mechanism to enforce this was incredibly clever on paper. It worked by exploiting Western dominance over maritime insurance and finance.
Yes, historically, the vast majority of the world's maritime insurance is provided by a network based primarily in London, Europe, and the United States.
Known as the Protection and Indemnity Clubs, or P&I Clubs.
Right. Western service providers could only legally insure, finance, or provide ships for a cargo of Russian oil if the buyer provided documentation attesting that they paid at or below that $60 limit.
So if Moscow wanted access to reliable, efficient Western shipping logistics, they had to accept the reduced profit margins dictated by the cap.
Because they desperately needed those logistics to move that volume of oil.
I want to make sure you, the listener, really grasp this because it directly affects your daily life.
It ever does.
When you go to the gas station and fill up your tank, the price on that digital readout is directly tied to this invisible war of attrition and maritime insurance in London.
If the West had just banned the oil outright, the price at your local pump would have doubled or tripled.
So they created this mechanism.
Yeah.
Think of the price cap not as a roadblock, but as a heavily regulated toll booth.
That's a great analogy.
The goal was not to stop the cars from driving on the highway. It was to siphon off the toll money to make the trip less profitable for the driver.
And early on, the data shows this actually had a measurable success.
Yeah. Our sources highlight that from January to March 2023, Russian federal oil revenues dropped more than 40% compared to the previous year.
That is a massive hit to any state budget.
Furthermore, Russian Urals crude, which is the specific type of oil they sell, started trading at a staggering $25 to $35 discount compared to the global Brent crude benchmark.
And by February 2024, tighter enforcement measures actually widened that discount to about $19 a barrel.
The sources point out that Russia effectively had to write lower values into its tax system, institutionalizing the penalty that the cap created.
The toll booth was working.
But wait, hold on a second. Before we go further into the weeds of how this evolved, I want to push back on this idea.
Okay, go ahead.
If the cap was $60 and the West wanted to ensure compliance, why didn't they just enforce it with their navies?
Ah, right.
I mean, if you have this elegant policy on paper, but you know there might be cheaters, why not just use naval assets to physically inspect the ships and check the receipts?
You would think that physical enforcement is the logical next step, but it is not that simple.
Why not? It seems like an obvious fix to ensure the toll booth is actually collecting the toll.
International maritime law makes boarding ships in international waters highly escalatory and legally fraught.
Because of the freedom of navigation.
Exactly. The principle of freedom of navigation is fiercely protected. Unless a vessel is operating in the territorial waters of a Western nation, a navy cannot simply stop and board a sovereign-flagged vessel.
Without risking a massive international incident.
Right. Furthermore, the sheer volume of traffic makes it practically impossible. You have thousands of tankers moving millions of barrels daily.
The navies of the world do not have the resources to conduct customs inspections on the open ocean.
So the enforcement had to rely entirely on the financial sector, the paperwork, the attestations, the insurance certificates.
And this is where the conceptually elegant policy ran into the brick wall of reality.
Yeah, the policy underestimated the sheer willpower of a nation desperate to fund its military, and it underestimated the adaptability of global commodity markets.
The cap relied on the assumption that Russia would perpetually need Western maritime insurance and shipping infrastructure.
It assumed that the toll booth was the only way to get to the destination.
But commodity markets are highly adaptable ecosystems. When a producer needs to sell and a buyer wants to buy, they will find a way.
What happens when drivers realize the toll booth is too expensive?
They start building their own off-road trails to bypass the toll booth altogether.
Exactly. The exporting nation aggressively built alternative networks. The market infrastructure on which the cap's logic depended became less central to Russian trade over time.
This proves that economic coercion in a globalized market has a distinct half-life.
The initial shock works, but over time, the target adapts, mutates, and finds a way around the pressure.
And that adaptation is what birthed the phenomenon I mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive.
The shadow fleet.
Yes. The sources detail a massive structural shift, the creation of the shadow fleet. By February 2026, the texts indicate that Russia had amassed an armada of 1,300 aging tankers.
Operating entirely outside Western jurisdiction.
To put that in perspective for us listening, by that point, a staggering 56% of Russian crude was being carried by these sanctioned shadow vessels.
While only 33% used the G7 or European Union tankers that complied with the price cap.
The trade routes shifted heavily too. Instead of moving oil a short distance to Europe, the ships began sailing much longer routes, heading directly toward China, India, and Turkey.
The sheer scale of this parallel export system is astounding. They completely bypass the intended financial choke point.
By essentially creating their own shipping ecosystem from scratch. But I want to understand the mechanics of this evasion.
It is pretty complex.
You mentioned that they bypass the insurance requirement. How do 1,300 massive oil tankers just operate in the shadows?
Right, it is not like they are invisible.
The sources talk about flag hopping and opaque intermediary companies, but for a listener who does not work in global logistics, how does a ship actually hide in plain sight on the ocean?
The mechanics of this evasion are a masterclass in exploiting legal loopholes. Let us break down flag hopping first.
Okay.
Every commercial vessel on the ocean must be registered to a specific country flying its flag. This flag determines which country's laws apply to the ship.
Right, so a ship has a nationality, basically.
Historically, many ships register in countries with flags of convenience, like Liberia or Panama, because of favorable tax laws and less stringent oversight.
So what does the shadow fleet do?
What they do is register a ship in one country, and the moment Western regulators identify that ship and flag it for sanctions evasion, the ownership company dissolves.
Just vanishes on paper.
Yeah, and then it reforms under a new name and re-registers the ship under a different country's flag.
So they might hop from Gabon to Eswatini to Barbados in a matter of months.
Exactly. It creates a constantly shifting bureaucratic shell game that makes tracking the true ownership nearly impossible.
Wow. And then there's the manipulation of the tracking systems, right?
Secondly, yes, there's the widespread manipulation of automatic identification systems, or AIS.
AIS is a tracking system that uses satellite relays and VHF radio signals to broadcast a ship's location, speed, and heading to other ships and coastal authorities.
It is designed for safety to prevent collisions, but shadow fleet vessels frequently engage in what is called spoofing.
What does that look like?
They use software to broadcast a fake location, making it appear they are sailing in the Mediterranean when they are actually loading crude oil at a port in the Baltic Sea.
Or they will simply go dark by turning the transponder off entirely during the illicit transfer of oil.
Yes. Finally, you have the opaque intermediary companies.
Right, the shell corporations.
These are set up in jurisdictions with high corporate secrecy, like certain free trade zones in the Middle East or Asia.
And when a cargo of oil is sold, these intermediaries create two sets of books.
One set of documents shows a price below the $60 cap. to satisfy any lingering Western service providers or port authorities.
while the actual transaction between the buyer and the Russian seller happens at a much higher market price through alternative banking channels.
The enforcement agencies found themselves chasing a constantly moving target of falsified documents, spoofed GPS signals, and hidden ownership structures.
It is a regulatory nightmare.
Completely.
It is like the ultimate high-stakes game of global whack-a-mole, except the moles are carrying millions of barrels of highly flammable crude oil.
That is a very accurate, if terrifying, way to put it.
And the friction this created for Western enforcement agencies is evident in the timeline the sources provide.
The European Union found itself passing successive
By July 2025, they even lowered the crude cap from $60 to $47.60 a barrel, trying to squeeze the margins even further.
But because the financial cap was leaking so badly due to these deceptive practices, the conflict shifted into a phase of direct physical disruption.
Yeah, the sources bring us right up to the developments of March and April 2026.
Ukraine, realizing the economic statecraft was porous and the paperwork was being manipulated, turned to physical strikes against the very infrastructure that monetizes the oil.
They launched long-range drone strikes against key Baltic terminals, specifically the ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga.
And the damage was severe.
The sources state these strikes knocked out 40% of the storage capacity at Primorsk and reduced Russia's export capability by 1 million barrels per day.
That represents about 20% of their total export capacity.
It is one thing to manipulate an insurance document in a boardroom in Dubai. It is an entirely different reality when the actual physical storage tanks are burning on the Baltic coast.
The shift from financial maneuvering to kinetic strikes shows the desperation to close the loopholes.
Right.
The shift to kinetic strikes is a direct admission that the financial mechanisms failed to achieve their primary objective.
When you cannot stop the flow of money through banking regulations, you resort to destroying the physical infrastructure that generates the product.
The drone strikes on Ust-Luga and Primorsk are significant because those ports are massive, sprawling complexes of pipelines, pumping stations, and specialized loading equipment.
Once a storage tank or a specialized pumping facility is destroyed, it takes months, sometimes years, to rebuild.
Especially when the targeted nation is cut off from Western engineering components. But even with these physical strikes, the political response reveals the ongoing legal paralysis.
Yeah, the text notes that UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer authorized the military to detain 25 shadow vessels passing through UK waters in March 2026.
This was supposed to be a show of force, right? A physical enforcement of the sanctions.
Yet zero boardings actually happen.
Why? Because of the intense hurdles of international maritime law and the severe escalation risks?
If the Royal Navy boards a rusty, uninsured shadow fleet vessel in the English Channel, and the crew resists.
Or worse, the ship is damaged and spills 1 million barrels of crude oil into the channel.
Right. The financial and environmental liability falls on the coastal state.
The West wants to stop the ships, but they do not want the immense risk of boarding them.
So you have this incredibly tense standoff. You have 17, 18, 19 sanctions packages.
You have empty threats of boarding vessels, and you have drones hitting the terminals.
But the shadow fleet continues to sail. When you look at all of this, the endless iterative sanctions, the spooked GPS signals, the fake insurance documents, the legal paralysis, it really makes you step back and look at the bigger picture. We keep trying to plug these holes with legislation.
We write a law, they find a loophole.
We write a new law, they buy older ships and forge new documents. It proves that economic statecraft is an exhausting game of trying to regulate human greed.
It really is.
You can legislate a $60 limit. You can blacklist 342 ships. You can threaten maritime boardings. But human ingenuity in the service of covetousness will simply buy an older ship, forge the insurance papers, and sail in the dark.
It is a fundamental flaw in human nature.
We think we can fix the problem by changing the external rules, but the internal drive remains untouched.
Which actually brings us to the theological texts we are analyzing for this deep dive.
Yes, the economic data provides the symptoms, the price spreads, the shadow fleets, the burning terminals.
But the second provided text offers the spiritual diagnosis.
Let us look at the book of James, specifically chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. This passage asks a blunt, penetrating question to its readers.
Where do wars and fightings come from?
And the text answers its own question by stating that they originate from the lusts or pleasures that are actively campaigning within human members.
It is a striking pivot.
We just spent all this time looking at Brent crude spreads, attestation documents, and drone strikes on Baltic terminals. But James looks right past all of that vast machinery.
He ignores the geopolitical borders and the economic treaties and points the finger directly at the human soul.
Can you break down the exegesis of this passage provided in our sources? What is James actually saying about the nature of conflict?
The exegetical detail provided in the source material regarding James 4 is incredibly revealing, especially when applied to the scale of conflict we are discussing.
Right, because James was writing in the 1st century, during a time when the Roman Empire enforced the Pax Romana, a kind of external, heavily militarized peace.
But James is addressing dispersed, persecuted Christians who are experiencing intense internal conflict. He asks, "From whence come wars and fightings among you?"
And the original Greek words used here are highly specific.
Yes. The word for wars is polemos. This is not a word for a brief skirmish, a momentary argument, or a sudden loss of temper.
It denotes a state of war, a prolonged, calculated military campaign.
And the word for fightings is mashai, which refers to the specific battles within that broader war.
So the central theological idea here is that external conflicts, even massive industrialized ones in Eastern Europe spanning 4 years, utilizing drones and shadow fleets, are the outward, physical fruit of an internal spiritual reality.
Exactly. James diagnoses this condition by pointing to the lusts, the Greek word hedonon, from which we get the word hedonism.
But he uses a fascinating verb to describe what these lusts are doing.
The text says they are actively campaigning, which translates from the participle stratowomenon.
Which implies a relentless, organized internal military assault.
Your desires for comfort, for security, for territory, for black gold, or for energy dominance are not passive.
They are actively waging a military campaign within your members, fighting to take control of your will.
The conflict is not fundamentally about geography, market share, or historical borders.
It is about a heart at war with its creator, an idol factory seeking ultimate satisfaction in created things like territory or wealth, rather than finding satisfaction in the creator himself.
And when those internal campaigns for dominance meet the resistance of someone else's desires, the result is polemos.
You know, as you described these ships turning off their transponders to smuggle oil in the dark and using fake shell companies to bypass the law,
Yeah.
it sounds just like what James is describing about the human heart. It is a striking analogy.
It really fits.
The 1,300-ship shadow fleet is the perfect physical manifestation of the unregenerate human heart.
Just as these illicit oil tankers switch off their AI's transponders to smuggle oil in the dark and bypass Western maritime law, the human heart turns off its spiritual conscience to smuggle sin in the dark, bypassing God's moral law.
The ships flag hop to avoid accountability from regulators, and the human mind rationalizes and shifts blame to avoid conviction from the Holy Spirit.
They create fake manifests to hide the true price of the oil, and we create fake outward appearances to hide the true cost of our covetousness.
It bridges the geopolitical data with the biblical text in a way that is incredibly convicting.
It definitely is.
But I want to connect this to the Reformed theology perspective the sources bring up. The text mentions the Westminster Confession in relation to this concept.
Right.
For a listener who might not be well-versed in 17th century theological documents, how does the Westminster Confession explain this condition of the human heart?
And why does it mean that things like price caps are doomed to fail?
Exactly.
Well, the analogy of the shadow fleet perfectly illustrates the theological framework provided by the Westminster Confession, specifically Chapter 6, Section 2.
Which deals with the fall of man and the corruption of nature.
Yes. The confession was drafted in the 1640s by theologians who were living through a brutal civil war, so they understood human conflict intimately.
They taught a doctrine commonly referred to as total depravity.
Now, that term is often misunderstood. It does not mean that every human being is as evil as they could possibly be.
Or that people are incapable of doing things that appear outwardly good.
Right. Rather, it means that the corruption of sin has infected every part, every faculty of the human soul and body, the mind, the will, and the affections.
Because the core operating system is corrupted by this active, campaigning desire for self-rule, humanity is naturally inclined toward rebellion against divine law.
When you apply that doctrine to the geopolitical stage, the failure of the $60 price cap to stop the bloodshed proves the theological point precisely.
External legislation can never cure an internal spiritual rot.
You cannot cure the total depravity of the human heart with an economic sanction, no matter how brilliantly designed it is by the brightest minds at the Treasury Department.
The law can point out the violation, it can even punish the violator, but it cannot change the nature of the desires.
The lust for leverage, dominance, and wealth will simply find a new, illicit channel to flow through, just like the shadow fleet finding new, uninsured routes to non-Western buyers.
The external law just forces the internal sin to become more creative in its evasion.
It does.
That observation forces a hard, uncomfortable look at where society places its confidence. We spend so much time analyzing the 17th sanctions package,
Or debating the merits of a two-tier price cap.
hoping that if we just tweak the policy enough, we can engineer peace.
But if economic engineering, dynamic price caps, and maritime threats cannot fix the underlying corruption of the heart, then placing our ultimate hope in secular institutions to bring about lasting peace is a massive error.
We keep looking to Geneva, to Washington, to Brussels, expecting them to solve a problem that originates in the human soul.
The texts argue that trusting in diplomatic maneuvering or market manipulation to legislate morality is relying on what Reformed theology calls false refuges.
We run to these systems for safety, but they cannot protect us from the root cause of the danger.
That is the tragedy of the secular worldview. It inherently trusts in these false refuges.
The secular mind believes that human nature is fundamentally good, or at least malleable.
And therefore, if we just get the policy right, if we just close the loopholes in the maritime insurance market, if we just pass one more international treaty, we can engineer lasting peace.
But the Reformed view recognizes all such attempts as broken cisterns that cannot hold water.
They will always leak because the material they are made of human effort is flawed.
This brings us to a huge, stabilizing doctrine discussed in our sources, the doctrine of God's sovereign providence.
When you realize that human institutions are false refuges, you have to look for a true refuge.
The text references the Westminster Confession, chapters 3 and 5, affirming that God rules over everything.
Chapter 3 speaks of God's eternal decree, and Chapter 5 speaks of his providence.
The assertion is that God, from all eternity, did freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass.
His decree covers not just the spiritual realm or the church, but the entirety of the global energy markets, the shipping lanes, and the wills of earthly kings.
Consider the scale of what we are discussing. Russia produces roughly 8.6 million barrels of crude every single day.
The shadow fleet moves millions of those barrels.
The theological assertion here is that not a single one of those barrels is pumped out of the ground, loaded onto a tanker, or sailed through the Danish Straits apart from the sovereign decree of God.
He governs the actions of the oligarchs, the regulators, and the drone operators, directing all things to his appointed end.
That is a staggering thought when you contrast the actions of earthly kings with the nature of the Lord Jesus Christ.
We see rulers in Moscow, Kiev, or Washington fighting for borders, for energy dominance, for legacy.
Earthly kings will shed the blood of hundreds of thousands of others to secure a temporary geographical kingdom.
They will build shadow fleets and burn terminals to maintain their leverage.
But the text contrasts this with Christ in his threefold office as prophet, priest, and king.
Christ did not shed the blood of others to build his kingdom. He shed his own blood to purchase a people.
Wait, before we go further, you used the phrase propitiatory blood when discussing the source text earlier.
Oh,
For a listener who might not be familiar with heavy theological terms, what does that mechanism look like in relation to this conflict?
it is essential to define that because it is the only true solution to the problem James 4 presents.
Yeah, go ahead.
Propitiation is a word that means a sacrifice that bears the wrath of God, turning away his judgment and satisfying his justice.
When we look at the covetousness, the wars, the shadow fleets, and the deception we've been discussing, the justice of a holy God demands that such rebellion be punished.
The penalty for turning off the spiritual transponder and smuggling sin is death. Earthly kings demand that their subjects pay the price for the king's glory.
But the propitiation of Christ is the exact opposite.
The king himself steps down, takes on human flesh, perfectly obeys the moral law that we evade, and then willingly absorbs the wrath of God on the cross in the place of his people.
His blood is propitiatory because it satisfies the righteous anger of God against the very covetousness that drives these global wars.
So, while earthly kings take life to secure their reigns, the heavenly king gave his life to secure the pardon and the changed hearts of his subjects.
This is why human legislation fails. It cannot provide a propitiation for past sins, nor can it provide the Holy Spirit to change the desires of the heart going forward.
Only the finished work of Christ accomplishes that.
I want to bring this immense theological concept down to the everyday reality for you, the listener. Because geopolitics and theology can feel very abstract until they hit your wallet.
Very true.
The sources cite an incredible surge in oil prices that occurred in April 2026. The price spiked to nearly $120 per barrel.
And this was not just because of the Baltic drone strikes. It was due to severe escalating tensions in the Middle East, specifically a U.S.-Israeli war with Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
When a major choke point like Hormuz closes, a massive percentage of the world's oil is trapped.
So a listener sees their heating bill spike dramatically. They go to the gas pump and see prices they have never seen before.
They read the headline that $100 billion in illicit oil revenue is funding a shadow fleet, and they see global conflict spreading.
The natural human reaction is anxiety. It feels like the world is spinning out of control.
So how does a reformed understanding of providence, this idea that God ordains the movement of every single barrel, change the listener's reaction from panic to peace in the face of a $120 barrel of oil?
It changes everything about their reaction because it provides an eternal context for temporal chaos. It shifts the foundation of their hope.
Knowing we are living in what theologians call the times of the Gentiles and the church age provides immense, unshakable stability.
A believer armed with this understanding recognizes that they are not called to fix the fallen world through perfectly engineered price caps, political activism, or anxiety over the news cycle.
Their calling is to witness to the King of Kings, whose rule is absolute and currently active.
When oil hits $120 a barrel because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and heating bills double, the secular mind panics because its only refuge, economic stability and political order, is crumbling before their eyes.
They realize the false refuges are failing.
But the believer understands that these crises, these wars, these shadow fleets, and rumors of wars are part of the sovereign administration of history.
God is not pacing the floors of heaven worried about the G7 sanctions package.
The believer does not place their hope in the European Union's ability to regulate the shadow fleet. They place their hope in the immutable fact that the Lord reigns over the chaos.
They understand that human depravity, no matter how heavily funded by illicit oil revenue or how cleverly hidden by flag hopping, can never thwart the divine decree.
The rise and fall of commodity prices and earthly kingdoms are temporary. The kingdom of God is eternal.
Therefore, even in economic hardship, they can have a peace that surpasses understanding, knowing the architect of history is also their father. Synthesizing the two halves of this deep dive, we see a remarkable, multi-layered picture of reality.
The mechanics of the Ukraine-Russia war reveal a brilliant but highly porous economic chess game over hydrocarbons.
The West tried to use the infrastructure of global commerce, the maritime insurance, the P&I clubs, the shipping logistics against a major energy exporter.
And while it caused massive friction and reduced revenues initially by imposing a $19 discount on Urals crude, it was met with a structural evasion effort of unprecedented scale.
The shadow fleet of 1,300 uninsured ships proves that markets adapt.
Yet beneath the shipping rats, the falsified insurance documents, and the burning storage terminals in the Baltic Sea lies the unchanged reality of total depravity.
The warring lusts described by James are what truly drive nations to slaughter. Nations will utilize whatever resources they can extract from the earth and whatever loopholes they can find in the law to fund the campaigns of their own covetousness.
The data gives us the what, but James gives us the why.
And that reality leads to a critical final application for you, the listener.
The source text urges a piercing examination of the self. It is incredibly easy to look at oligarchs, global leaders, or illicit shipping companies and condemn their covetousness and deception.
We can look at the shadow fleet and shake our heads at the evasion.
But the shadow fleet of our own secret sins is far more dangerous to our eternal souls than any physical armada floating in the Black Sea.
We all have that internal tendency to turn off our spiritual transponders. We all operate in the dark, pursuing our lusts while maintaining a veneer of compliance, creating false manifests to show the world.
We flag hop from one justification to another to avoid the conviction of the Holy Spirit. If we are honest, our hearts are actively campaigning for our own desires every day.
The geopolitical conflict is just a macrocosm of the microcosm inside us. True peace cannot be found in secular prosperity, economic dominance, or political treaties.
The only true lasting peace is found in the propitiatory blood of the Lamb, the one who perfectly submitted his will to the Father, succeeding where every earthly king and every one of us has failed.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day.
As you watch governments draft the next round of maritime sanctions, as you read the news about the 20th or 21st sanctions package trying in vain to plug the holes in the global market, ask yourself this.
Are you placing your hope in the flawed legislation of men to restrain evil? Are you trusting in false refuges to secure your peace?
Or are you looking to the skies with expectancy for the premillennial return of the Prince of Peace, who alone can still the warring hearts of the nations?
We started by talking about the desire for a clear diagnosis, like a clean X-ray. The geopolitical reality is murky, and the depravity of the human heart is complex, but the cure remains singular and clear.
True peace is not found in a policy.
It is found in a person.